welcome everybody to this seminar or this startup talk with Karin Ackerholm called Entrepreneurial Journeys, Success Factors and How to Future-Proof Ventures. We will touch upon topics like how do you become an entrepreneur, and does it always have to start with your own idea? For that, we have invited Karin Ackerholm, who is innovation advisor at Linköping University and guides both students and researchers in their early journeys to become innovators and entrepreneurs. So she will bring light into the different ways of starting entrepreneurial journeys, and we'll discuss the role of innovation and entrepreneurship in creating positive development and sustainable growth. So welcome to this slightly different startup talk, where we will not talk with an entrepreneur who had their own big journey, but where we have someone who can give us a more holistic picture. Before we start with that, I want to say a few things about LEAD and our startup talks. And I can start with introducing myself. My name is Eva Bolmer. I am the project leader at LEAD, mainly responsible for the BOOTA program and our venture arena. Our BOOTA program is a program for early startups who have their own ideas and want to work with them and learn the basics in entrepreneurship. But we also have some other resources that we with LEAD help you with. And to explain that, I want to talk a little bit more about LEAD. LEAD is a business incubator situated both in Linköping and Norrköping. For those of you who haven't been in contact with us before, we have about 45 member companies or startups there, which we help with directed resources to grow bigger and safer. And we have also two entrepreneurship programs, which are called Entrepreneurs in Residence, which is a 6-month trainee program, and Sommarmatchen, which is a summer job about 5 weeks. And these programs, there you can test out or try out if you like to be an entrepreneur. So there you will get ideas from researchers at the university or from Östergötland. And you'll be learning our methods and work with 100% with market verification and other methods that we teach you to see if these ideas are worth spending time and money on. And why I'm talking about these programs now is because the recruitment for them is finally open, and it is open until the 20th of February. So we hope that also with this startup talk, where we will talk about the different beginnings of entrepreneurial journeys, that we maybe can inspire you to find out more about entrepreneurship. And if you are interested, then don't forget to apply for the programs. But with that said, let's introduce Karin Ackerholm. Hey.
Hey.
Maybe we can start with you telling us more about yourself and how you ended up at LEAD Innovation and what you do there.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for hosting me today. Well, I ended up at LEAD Innovation, it's over 9 years ago now, which is strange to me. It's the longest I've been in any position, but that also tells you how interesting this job is. I come from like a background of not necessarily following the patterns, or rather not really liking to be, in the same format as everyone else. So, I mean, long ago, or like starting out, I've always been interested in technology and these kind of rather what it can be used for than necessarily only the technical, development. And that can, be signified, for example, that I started out with my high school training. I started with humanistic sciences, but I also added extra mathematics and data. So that's kind of the kind of person I am. Don't follow the programs necessarily. But in my university degree, I'm a cognitive scientist. That's my base training. And I'm very much focused on design and complex systems was sort of my master profile. And going from that into design, and then more and more into understanding that it was relevant to combine the problem-solving skills of design with also business sense and that kind of logic, building a business model around the kind of interactive applications I was working with. So that ended me up in this position now, and I've been thriving in it since 9 years, but also developed the role, of course. When I started out, it wasn't the same as today. There have been numerous changes in the role, but it's still exciting.
And we can dive right in. What would you say? Like, can you describe different entrepreneurial journeys that you have experienced during your time at Leo Innovation?
Yes, and on the other hand, there are so many. I mean, you have to sort of condense 9 years of experience, but also some of them are longer and some of them are shorter in the sense both how long they've actually taken. As you know, probably there can be a very early starting point when we in the research domain, we start discussing what could potentially be innovated or what could be a potential outcome of research. And then it's years and years until there's actually a result to be commercialized. So in that sense, you may have known these researchers over many years before they actually start coming to something that could be interesting to explore as an innovation or as an idea for an innovation, I should say, because the idea stage is where we work within the university domain. Then I also, of course, work sometime part of my time at LEAD, where I actually get to follow the traces of some of the entrepreneurs over into the incubator environment. So some of them I've also had the fortune to follow both during their LEAD time and then also in the incubator phase. And well, some of the ones that we see out now that are, growing and are exploring their journey outside of the incubation phase is, of course, Kira. I take as a good example because they were very keen entrepreneurs and very explorative in their early days as students at LEU, but then they moved on to bigger challenges or goals later on. And also some of the companies that are at LEAD now, Arbo Air is one of them, of course, that I've followed, but also research ventures that we've supported. And then also some of them me and my colleagues at LIU may have done bits and pieces of their journey. So it's not always me supporting the same entrepreneurs or the same innovators, all of this path, but rather if it's relevant with, for example, digital competence or thinking of how things could benefit society, then I might be called upon to work with those factors. And then I have knowledgeable colleagues who know other things, who know like special science fields, or they're very good at, for example, looking at how things can be quality assured for example, use in health sciences or in caring situations. And that's not my field. So therefore, it's also good to know other people who know other things than you do.
And how does it work if you talked about, for example, Arbo Air, which is a LEAD member right now, but you had contact with them already during when they were part of Leo Innovation, or like getting help from you. How would you say, are there any differences in like how you work with them and how much time they spend? Because when they are like at LEAD, then like we try to accelerate very fast. What are you working with at Leo Innovation?
Well, I would say that it does change over time, both because as you grow the idea and you realize when you move into testing and understanding that there is a potential in this, then both that the team is more engaged, but also not just the commitment, but also the requirements for you to do things increases. So therefore, in the beginning, it might be a couple of hours in every week you do things, or on your spare time during your studies. And also when we talk about researchers developing their ideas, I sometimes say that I don't know a researcher that works only full time. Most of them already work more than once a classic full time. So therefore, finding the hours to actually spend on exploring a potential for commercialization is it's challenging even in the beginning, even in the early days when you don't necessarily need to spend so much time. So in that sense, yes, it does change. And also in that way, many move out of other tasks to find time to actually explore their entrepreneurial journey. So that does change.
Mm-hmm. So what is it that, if I'm a student and I want to become involved with entrepreneurship, how do you help there? Like, how does it look like more practically? How you help them? What are the what do you want the entrepreneurs to focus on in order to become successful entrepreneurs?
Actually, that's two questions, because the first question, if you're a student, then now actually we don't work with students no more, because we have a separate student support system, and we haven't had that for a few years. So therefore, people like me working with research commercialization have also covered the base of working with students. However, now we have specific student advisors. So in that case, I would say that you should explore talking to LiU Student Innovation and the driven people working there. So we have two colleagues, Simon and Oliver. So that would be the first step. And then, I mean, what do you say? Like, what do you work with? Or what do you
more practically, like the entrepreneurs.
I mean, all of it is sort of focused on determining potential and reducing risk. I mean, that is, in a sense, a very simplified way to describe the whole journey, I would say. It's like finding what is the potential in the beginning. Is there actually potential, or should we just scrap this? Is it a good idea or not? Because that's also a question you get sometimes. Do you think this is a good idea? And then my usual response is that it could be, but even if I think it seems relevant, that's not good enough for you. You need better answers. So therefore, you need to, for example, go into the market, explore what's already out there, what's the competition, or what are the perhaps rather bad but still alternatives that people are using today. How do they solve this issue that you're addressing in a more or less relevant or good way today? And if you don't have that background, then there's no value in asking people, do you think this is good? Because me saying that, sometimes I also tease them by saying, well, if I say yes, then you have a market of one. And if I were to, invest in every idea that I meet, I would be, in that case, either a billionaire, or I would be, out of my money, because I meet too many good potential, ideas. But you don't know if that could actually move into being an innovation, which is when it actually has provided value in the marketplace. So therefore, you can't put your bets on every idea, and you need to do this explanation together with potential customers to actually find out if there is value and if they see the value, so they want to pay for it or support you.
Mm-hmm. And that is actually also what we teach the early startups in, for example, the Bota program that we have here. And many, and I know from myself, from my early journey, that sometimes you can be scared of, especially competitors, and looking at them. Sometimes you're afraid, oh no, there is a competitor. But actually, there's a lot, as you said, Karin, there's a lot to learn from competitors, both benchmarking, but also if you talk to your customers and they are using a competitor, you can find out what they like about them and what they don't like about them, to find what unique selling point you could have in your own startup. So that's really a important point that we can give to all of the listeners out there. If they have an idea, don't be afraid to go to competitors and talk to them, or talk to your potential customers about potential competitors, because that's really important and can teach you a lot. We got an answer in our question and answer Q&A section, and actually I forgot to say that before, but if you listeners have a question, feel free to write them in the question and answer section. So the question is it only LiU students that can get in touch with Karin and the team? And now you already said that it's not the students that get in touch with you, but they should get in touch with the LiU Student Innovation. But is it only from LiU or is it also others?
Yeah, our support at the LiU Innovation and also for LiU Student Innovation is, as the name says, for LIU affiliates. So either students or researchers or other role at the universities are the ones that we work with. However, sometimes it can be relevant for other parties to get in contact with us to reach researchers or to have contact with potential students they could work with. So I wouldn't close the door, but I would say that our processes are to support researchers and the students at LIU. So therefore, both for the student innovation support and for us supporting researchers, it's targeted towards LIU contacts. But I know, and that can be an important distinction to say that also for LEAD, that's not the same case. You also have, entrepreneurs from anywhere in society that can come to you. So some of them do come from us at the university, but some of them travel their other routes. So therefore at LEAD, it's a mix, but from our part, it's working with the university staff or students.
Mm-hmm. Yes, let's move on to the next part, or in general forward. What do you have to, like, in order to start, do you have to have your own idea? What do you think about that?
Well, I wouldn't say you have to have an idea. One thing is, of course, that either you could work with your own, like, for example, the good way is often to start with a need. You have a hunch of there's a gap here. Somebody's not solving this issue, or it's not solved in a good way. We see potential in that there could be better ways to do this. And then you don't necessarily have the idea how that's to be done. Then you probably just have, an inkling that this could be a problem worth solving. So that's a good thing to start with, an insight on there being things to solve. However, I think your question also connects to that. Sometimes we think that everyone should, or talk about it like everyone should develop their own ideas. And one thing I should say is that ideas are a dime a dozen. It's easy to come up with ideas, and we all do. I mean, even in our everyday lives, not necessarily the nerds in this like innovation and entrepreneurship system, but every one of us are sort of innovative in our daily practices. However, we're not innovators, but we're innovative in that we're exploring things, we're finding solutions to simple daily problems. So it's not relevant to put such value in the idea, but because that could be potentially just, irrelevant as soon as you talk to the first customer. Sometimes we say that there are not that many first concepts that survive that first, contact with the customer, because they will say this and that is irrelevant and this and that would need to be much better. So the same concept will probably be developed. But on the other hand, I mean, this with thinking of it as an idea that you're sort of exploring, that's a good starting point to think of this as a hypothesis. That's very easy to talk to with researchers because they're used to setting up hypotheses and then testing them. Sometimes the rest of us are a bit too keen on keeping that baby, intact. This is my idea and I want it to be perfect and I want everybody to like it. So therefore, daring to take the leap into having other people give opinions on it, potential customers, potential investors, and others, can be rather scary. So I sometimes think that we put too much emphasis on that and then daring to take the leap is the biggest thing, but daring to use the insight you get and daring to change again and try, not the first time, but the second time with a new concept might be worse, because then you need to actually be active, curious, and listen with an open mind to people bashing your first concept and saying this is shit. And that can be really challenging, but also a good learning experience, because then you understand that this is what they thought was great. So we could perhaps do even more of that. So that's an explorative mindset that helps you.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually really interesting. We at LEAD have Åsa Glavich, who is really great at like HR and those kind of things. And I think it was her, at least. She talked about the entrepreneurial mindset that you should always learn and want to grow. And as you said that now, with the like this idea or like this is shit, I was thinking directly, okay, but then ask like what exactly is shit, so
Exactly.
that you really find out like what is not good and what is good, so that you make sure to not only get like bad feelings from getting like really not what do you say, constructive feedback, but to actually learn like how can you make it better then.
And that also tying to this that you said, that also had said there's also studies on this. For example, there was this Project ILE report a few years back that was done by Sting, this incubator in Stockholm, that explored successful entrepreneurs and tried to see if there are any personality traits or others that could sort of show why they were more successful. And they realized that there aren't that many, or many think that, for example, they should be trailblazers, or these are, they have these different types of personality traits, for example, that they would have hugely more like power in processing data or whatever, or more attention or anything. But what they saw wasn't that all of these things were true. So they busted some myths with that report. It's a good read. But also to think, one of the things that they actually explored is this: with the things that stuck out were more the humility, for example, to know what you don't know. So therefore daring to, involve others, understanding your strengths very well and use them well, of course, but also understanding where you might need other people's help, or where you could complement with another team player. So how you could actually build a team, and also that you were a good team builder and culture builder in your company. So you were that person who can actually build this into a working organization. And of course, that's a relevant thing for when you end up at actually building a company. But already in the starting phase, we know that these really good teams that sort of form around the early idea can also help each other in exploring, and also help, pull this entrepreneurial journey when it's hard, when it's rough, or when we just get no's everywhere. It can be really hard to get closed doors and people not being interested in your product or service, and having that support helps. But also having people perhaps question what do you think is obvious. So also that curiosity of like you were saying, if you do get this is not good, or we don't like that, daring to ask why, or actually exploring that. So why wouldn't you like this? Not just going like, okay, then I get it, we're out of here. But understanding what's the thing that makes them say no, or what's not relevant. Is it the price? Is it the performance? Is it that they see something else that's even more important? Because perhaps we could include that in our product if we knew about it. So these kind of things, but also that you're sort of that you have this perhaps understanding of what is the customer value is also something that was in the study. So the sense of customer value, and also exploring the value with the customer, is another of these traits that they saw stuck out. So I think that's some of the factors that are relevant to think of, and neither are they these, the kind of models that we sometimes see of entrepreneurs, but also it shows more what I think we see in the early journeys, is that people have help of interacting with others, both around the idea, like this with the team setup, but also exploring this with potential customers or others who could give feedback on what is like the industry standard, what would we be measured upon, or what kind of factors are relevant in the future. What's this, how's this development in this field that you're exploring? Could there be things to look out for and make sure that your product already includes before the competition is already there? So that's one of the things I think you should focus on.
So it's not about the idea, and it's not about like the maybe the knowledge that the person has to have, because actually we also got a question from another listener who asked, do I need to have good knowledge of IT as an entrepreneur before starting a company that relies on digital technology?
Well, of course, it's always easy to say, well, you need to know IT if you're working with IT. Then of course, it's also true that you can learn during the journey, so you don't need to know everything. However, if you are not knowledgeable in that field and you're moving in that, it would be easier if you could include or engage people, build your team, add to the competence base. And therefore you might not need, but you need to know that this is the first person I'm recruiting, because if we're working with IT, of course, in the early days, you might develop a prototype with some support from others. And you might have, for example, the ability to use a student entrepreneur to help you with a certain part of the journey. We can talk about those opportunities as well. But you want to include the core types of competence you'll be using over time is relevant to add to the team rather than to keep buying them as consultancy services. So therefore you don't need to, but you need to add that to the team, I would say, or not in the first days, but rather soon.
Thank you. You said something before about that some journeys that you have helped or been part of are shorter and some take longer time. Did you see that these success factors that you talked about, that the ones who had shorter journeys or who moved forward faster, that they had more of these team building abilities, or that they knew what they needed to get help with and all of that?
I would say that this that I talked about with sense of customer value really helps with getting ahead sooner, or getting a fast track towards finding what could really be a potentially flourishing business. Because otherwise the risk is that you get only so far and then you realize this is not what the customer wants, and we have invested time and money and effort in something that sort of won't survive. So therefore you might have an early streak first and then a big head stop. There's no way forward. Whereas the other things that I said, like team players and all these things, are perhaps not as early, it's not as relevant in the early days, because then you might mull along. It's just my time, and you can spend the hours that you have on this. However, there comes a point when time is of essence, and then if you don't have the team around you, or where certain competences are needed, then that's at risk of slowing you down, because now we need somebody with this competence, and it will take some time to get them on board. So recruitment is a huge factor. And I work also for LiU in AI Sweden, which is this national initiative in accelerating AI application. And there, for example, we see this as a factor often, is that when you want to get started in applying AI in your field, and if you haven't got that competence in-house, then getting that person on board will take you some time. And then you stand there and sort of wait for this to happen, and everybody's hoping that this will get started, and without the competence on board, it's going to take some time. So rather than thinking of recruiting later, then having your idea of what you need can also perhaps open you to having those conversations, even if you're not ready to hire somebody, or if you're not ready to add them to your team and perhaps have them as a part of the owners of the company. I mean, it's good to have that explorative sense of thinking of what could be next. And then perhaps you just meet somebody at, over the coffee at LEAD, which is, I know, is a magical place to meet new people, or at other, these kind of forums that we sometimes meet in, also now digital a lot. Then you can have ears open to, wait, this is what this person said. Perhaps that could be relevant to discuss because we need a person like that in 8 months or wherever. So having that kind of sense of what we need is relevant early on, but you might not want to, sign them up right here and now.
Mm. Yes, and that's actually also something that we repeat a lot of time during the different programs that we have, that it's important to start building relationships, even if you don't want to hire them now. Then if they know you and they have seen the difference that you could have made in these 8 months, they get a better picture of who you are and where you're going. And it's always important to have a good network around you.
That's something I stress with students as well, because sometimes they tell me like, "What? But we don't know anybody." And then, yes, of course, for what you're doing now, then perhaps you don't know the right people, but either through people like me or others that have these bigger networks and have ways of showing you should talk to this person, and then you'll be, nudged in the right direction. That's a good start, but also to understand that the classmates that you have now when you're studying, and also perhaps other people in your, near field of interaction, might have other skill sets or other contexts you know about. So this would being open with, this is what I'm exploring, and this is the next step that I'm hoping to take, can also make them share other info with you. If I don't say that I'm exploring this entrepreneurial idea, then I might not know about and hear about things because they wouldn't have thought of talking to you about it. So this with actually being open is a very relevant trait in having that, having the opportunity of things happening to you because you actually made it so by being open that this is what I'm interested in. Then people can share info with you rather than you exploring or you deciding on who's relevant. Then they can explore this because they hear that it's relevant. So that's really a good factor in any of these dialogues.
Mm-hmm. And contacting different people or stakeholders or like experts in the field can sometimes be frightening to some people. But what value would you give the to go outside of one's comfort zone in the entrepreneurial journey or for becoming an entrepreneur?
I would say it's the core to being an entrepreneur. I mean, if it's comfortable, then it's probably not as innovative as you think. And also, either then you already know that this is good because you have data on it, or you've explored that earlier on, so therefore you already know. Otherwise, it's just a hunch. And having the sense of this being, valuable or relevant is not good enough. You need to verify that it's actually true, and that you can't do on your own. You need other people to give you input. So therefore, it can be uncomfortable. Like I said in the early part of this dialogue, that, it might seem that people are, tearing down your precious concept that you've worked so much with and invested so much in. On the other hand, that's only when you build it up from that, it's like the phoenix bird rising from the ashes. It's like, if you haven't gone through that process, then it really just was a dream. Because if you haven't tried it out, then we don't know if it could survive or if it could be relevant, and if it could thrive into something hugely successful. So there's no real success in keeping it there in your idea or in your brain, or rather just keeping it for yourself, because it won't grow. So if you want it to be, big and bold and actually grow in this world, then it needs oxygen and it needs to get out there.
Mm-hmm. And talking about making a success, we've said that we will talk a little bit about not only what success factors make good like entrepreneurs have, but also about the business. And as part of that, how do you see about sustainability and sustainable business models? Is it still a nice have, or would you say it's a must have?
I would say that we've gone from a few years back, it was like responsible ventures that are, where you look at what potentially impact or damage you could be doing, looking, tracking your performance was seen as, good enough. The classic 90s do no evil sense. That was sort of the way looking at this. However, there's been a huge leap in that in recent years. So that's the old way and no longer good enough. And it's where you also have, for example, EU legislation on larger corporations looking at their performance on ESG standards. So that's really standard now. So it's not something that you can see as a business advantage. It's a must-have. However, looking at sustainability, which is then, of course, that you don't just look at your traces, but rather you continually improve. That is something that still, in some businesses, can be seen as an advantage if everyone else is, hugely environmentally polluting or whatever, then of course it's better if you're not. But still, that's sort of getting more and more standard. And often there I see huge potential in the startup world, both for being the challenger, pushing the boundaries, but also for providing solutions to the problems of the bigger corporations. Sometimes a startup can be the ones exploring a technology that can clean up an industry or that can support a better social benchmark or whatever for that industry. So they can be industry challengers and also industry solutions in their smaller venture that in itself doesn't have such a big traction on the market. Then together with bigger players, and we see those collaborations a lot, then the startup community can really have an impact on industry shifts that need to happen. And then we have the biggest or the most daunting, perhaps, the ones that are really just in business to make the world better, to actually improve their industry or actually provide totally new ways of doing things. And those are the companies that we sometimes call impact companies. And that's not the norm. They are still, more challengers and more novel than the usual companies. However, we see more and more of them, and also some of the bigger, older companies getting inspired, and therefore, again, heightening their standards of what to see as the normal, way of doing business. So being a challenger like that can really change also how you see the normal level, and the norms have been changing. So I suspect, and also that's not just my suspicion, but rather the way we see, for example, these survey responses on sustainability over the recent years, we're pushing that. What is the next level all the time? So therefore, most companies now are looking into their impact and seeing how they're actually, performing, but not necessarily they haven't come as far as being challengers to their industry standards, but it's moving towards that direction.
Mm-hmm. And you said that the bigger companies, do they get more involved with startups? Have you seen change there?
We have seen very successful collaborations. I'm thinking of, for example, Ignite is a hugely successful and also very relevant way for both the bigger corporations of fueling their innovation processes, understanding what's out there and exploring together with smaller fast-tracked startups in what they could be doing together. And also there have been many of these also, for example, from the public financiers like Vinnova and others. They have had those programs with collaboration between smaller and bigger players, and not only corporations, but also, for example, public agencies and stuff that need the development inside their organizations as well. So I think that meeting between the bigger and the smaller players is very relevant. And also that, of course, the advantage, if you look at the corporation, then usually that's that they get this injection of new ideas, perhaps meeting new contacts, having insight of novel practices. That's really good for them. But also for the smaller startups, the budding corporations of tomorrow, they need also perhaps to learn about these practices of how do you run a big company successfully, or how can you scale things into that kind of logic where the companies that were started 10 or 15 years ago or even longer ago already are. So it gives them also a way of looking at how they can explore something that could be a journey over decades.
Mm-hmm. And we've been talking about, in the event description, we talked about how to future-proof your ventures. Do you want to explain that concept a little bit more, or like how to do that?
I think we've touched upon some of it, but perhaps not under the term of future-proofing, and it doesn't necessarily be the way you talk about it. But one thing is, of course, to understand that the standards you are assessed against, for example, this was the sustainability, will be continually changing. So what was good 5 years back is no longer, as relevant or shiny as it seemed back then. And this is shifting very rapidly. So therefore, both being open to and, having your in having the insight into understanding that you have to reassess these things. So there are no standard ways of judging the way. I mean, you can, for example, contrast that with, or talking about, for example, if you looked at what was seen as performance or speed a few years back, looking at what kind of internet connection you had. I mean, nobody now would be happy if you delivered their internet connection by a modem, by an old, really old modem, like when we started exploring the internet. However, sometimes I see that that's the way we talk about these things with sustainability or other things that have not been social responsibility, for example, that has not been on the charters for how do you work with entrepreneurship or how do you work with innovation. And therefore, it seems like this is good enough is an attitude that some people keep to the things that they are not accustomed with and that are not necessarily in their comfort zone again. So therefore, understanding that you need to keep track of these things and understand what is the current benchmark, what is the normal now, not the normal 10 years ago, and also understand that the normal is not where you can be a challenger or where you can have a potential of having an advantage. So if you want an advantage, you need to be ahead of that. So again, it's understanding what's around, and future-proofing then means keeping that image of the current level updated, but also acting upon these data. I mean, insight is one thing, but if you just look at it, there's no value in it. But if you act upon the insights that you gain, then you can really find a way of having an advantage business-wise, and also integrate these insights into your business model. So that's really the part of the future proofing, is having the ways of working that you actually use the insight you get.
And how do you get those insights? Do you have like some practical tools that we can share with the listeners?
Well, I think, of course, keeping updated on news media and whatever is good. However, there's always the risk that you're sort of in this echo chamber, that you hear and see the same things, because that's for all of us. It's not both because of what we talk about as bias. I mean, I will read the kind of things that trigger me, and that's the same for all of us. That if it says sustainability, if it talks about making an impact in society, or if it's novel and advanced technology, I'm all over it. But maybe that's not the only thing I should be reading. And the same goes for all of us, understanding what else you need to be informed of, but also perhaps what could be relevant to look at too. Both, for example, you could one technique or way of working is, of course, getting out of the kind of discussions or networks that you're in normally. If you look around yourself and everybody else has the same experience and everybody else has the same age, perhaps the same kind of context, then that's not necessarily a relevant and creative community. It can still be good business sometimes, but it's not the things that will give you novel insight. So again, stepping out of the comfort zone in daring to meet people who are very different, or taking those discussions, or, for example, also surfing other types of media, or understanding that perhaps things that I've heard about that seem relevant for example, the agriculture sector might be there now, but could it still make sense to understand these things or these shifts, even though I'm in aerospace or whatever field I'm in? Because sometimes that's also where you can create the most novel insight, is connecting different types of fields or connecting knowledge from one field to another. That's another type of innovation sometimes we talk about, is when you move things from one field to another. So daring to take that leap, but also being very curious. I mean, curiosity is a superpower in these things, because it sort of challenges your view on things. And like I said, that it's often the case that you end up in a funnel of getting the same kind of data all the time. So how can you open doors into that funnel? So if I, explore something, I don't understand this, then if you do, look into that a bit, then you will also see that you suddenly spot it everywhere in media. I think that's the same. We all have those stories of having seen nothing of something, and then when you start hearing about it, it's everywhere. So you can actually make that happen by trying to explore what are the things that people are talking about and start looking at, do I see it somewhere, So that's perhaps a technique to be using. Explore new subjects. It's like a homework.
And also the part like challenging yourself, and maybe, as you said, like get involved with people that are not like you, so that you get this part directly from them, maybe. So would you say, or what role does entrepreneurship have then for today's, like, the big sustainability issues?
A huge thing.
Yeah.
I would say both, because I mean, like I think I talked about in the introduction, is that the innovation part is getting things from idea to actual market application. But the entrepreneurship is, of course, exploring the options of building a sustainable, or also sustainable in the sense of environmental, social, and economic factors, but also thinking of it over long term. So how can this be a thriving business over years to come? And that ability, or that way of working, will help you both in the early days, but also long term. So I think that that's very relevant, this whole journey. And therefore also working like that will help you in any of these challenges, or any of these like positive developments we want to be making. I also saw we had a question in the Q&A about this, with how you can compensate the team. And that's perhaps tying back to also, I mean, in the beginning, it's often, commitment. So of course, people spending time, depending on what their role is and how hard it is for them to spend the hours, then they need to have some compensation, but it's not necessarily salary. And that's also something of a confusion for, I think, especially students, that they sometimes think that it's the same as getting a job in an existing company. And usually early days, what you might be getting either is a consultancy fee, because you're not part of the team, so you're doing work for that team, or it might be that you're then getting a cut of the company later on, so you're part of the owners. So of course those things, both actually giving that kind of compensation, but also the promise of, if you do this for example early task, and then we both realize that it's a good value, then we could offer you compensation in for example ownership of the company. So that's one model.
And so would you say that there are some maybe success factors for sustainable companies
specifically? Yeah, I mean, of course, again, it's about scrutinizing where we're at, but also keeping track of the ambition and the actual performance. Because I mean, we might have big and bold goals for being the changer of an industry, like I said, or the ones that really shift people's attitude towards the thing. But that's not going to happen over 2 years. It's going to be a longer. So this, with having a long-term vision, but also tracking the current performance and always keeping the momentum on getting better, no matter where you're at, raising the bar and making sure that you move ahead is sort of, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily specific to sustainable companies. It's just good business. But then again, sustainable companies are good business. That's also been shown. The same as, for example, for having diverse teams are more innovative. And although we know these things, we don't necessarily act upon them. So I would really advise you to think about what are perhaps the gaps that we have, both in our team in terms of competence, gender, experience, all these things, but also to think about, for example, what aren't we seeing because of the way we're working today? What might we be missing because of nobody is watching on these issues, or none of us know about these things? So that is a good way of thinking of how can we sort of see what's hidden to us now.
And why should startups care about sustainability from the beginning?
Because it makes business sense, and also because if we are talking about companies that are to survive in the future, I mean, we know that the ways of the old are no longer working. We've already built a massive debt by working the way we did in the old. So we can't do that no more. But also understanding that if we, for example, limit resources, if we don't have as much energy to spend, which has been obvious in recent days, then having a more sustainable and more, in that case, energy limited or not as, not as needy product that doesn't consume as much energy, that will be an advantage. And not because you care, which is something, but because it makes business sense. It's going to cost you. So that's the logic. And also because it will cost your customers not caring. So therefore, if you can help them solve that issue, it will make business sense to them as well. So you'll be a better player.
What are the difference then? Because like sometimes maybe there are some markets where sustainability is not as big as in others. We can talk about like market push or pull kind of with sustainability maybe. How do you, like, is there any way how startups can approach these different types?
I would say that that's the same kind of logic. And I talked about it with another colleague at Lead, Björn, who talked about this, that it's really the same kind of hypothesis testing that you do in market verification anyway, because you can look at these sustainability factors and see, are they an industry factor already in this market? Or are they, said to be in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time? And what does that mean for how we should prioritize? So perhaps we can't do everything, and that's a good sense, both in your, in your business venture, but also privately. We can't do everything all at once. So rather prioritize the biggest thing and the ones that are most advantageous to actually, shift and produce a better output. So therefore, understanding that we put our efforts on this issue, and that's often also where you see, for example, the bigger corporations that are now shifting towards sustainable procedures in their business. They have looked at their data, seen where are their biggest footprint today, and then targeted those issues rather than saying we're doing everything at once. So the same goes for then startups thinking of, if you're targeting a certain market, what are their problems currently, and what will be their problems connected to the societal challenges that we have, for example, climate change and other development that we're seeing, biodiversity loss, and they're not just ecological challenges, there are also social and economical challenges that could be relevant for us to have, as input to entering that market. So it's basic market research actually, and exploring how your business could actually be thriving in that market. Or if you couldn't, then that's probably not a good market to be in.
And I see that time is running out.
Yeah.
So I want to remind everyone who listens that if you have any questions, write them in our question and answers section. Karin, is there anything else that you wanted to say for this Startup Talks that you haven't had the chance to say yet?
No, I think I've covered most things. I got an advice from my husband. We talked about this. I always get nerves before. People think I'm very natural in these digital or giving, public talks and whatever, because I do it a lot, but I'll always get nerves. So that's one thing to know, that if you're not comfortable, that's just normal. All of us are, even those who may seem as they are, thriving in this standing on stage, or that they are networking experts or whatever, they might still be sensing their nerves. So that's one thing. Nobody's like necessarily just comfortable in every situation. But also that this is not, it's not odd to explore an idea. And also we have a rather limited, I would say, sense of who could be an entrepreneur or who could have an idea that could be a potential innovation. But it's getting to it, actually starting to explore. So not leaving it as, an idea on paper or in your mind, but starting to explore, could this be something, and who could give me input that shows this has value, or that this is just not a good way of exploring, or this couldn't give you value. no matter how much we tried, this wouldn't be successful. So daring to both show what you got and also wanting, their opinion that's actually a gift to somebody, saying, please, could you give me input on this? It's often a nice, dialogue. So people are very happy to share. So if you're daring that leap, it actually might not be as hard as you imagine, because we're often very happy to share, insight or opinion on things. So dare to ask. And then also to say that there is nobody who knows that any idea has value. So therefore, if you do get somebody saying early on that this is good or this is bad, don't take that first, comment as the only one that you listen to. So neither, critique or praise really is valuable in the early days, but rather you need more data. So it's not until you actually have a client that you can say that it's clear that this has value. So get started.
Yeah. And with that said, thank you, Karin, for being here today and for this interesting discussion. And I hope that we could inspire some of you listeners to find out more about entrepreneurship. And if you do, and you want to find out more about our entrepreneurship programs, Sommarmatchen and Entrepreneurs in Residence, check out our website, lead.se. But also, we will have our next startup talk, which is on February the 2nd, with Liam Hardy, who is a former entrepreneur in residence and is now the CEO of Selfion, one of the cases that he had been working on during the trainee program. So now he is CEO in that company. And he'll be talking more about his startup journey. So if there's anybody who wants to take the chance and hear more about the program and ask him some first-hand questions, then make sure to write down the date for our next startup talk, which is the 2nd of February. And the registration form is not opened yet, but it will be soon. So make sure to follow lead.se on our social media to not miss out on that opportunity. And with that said, once again, thank you, Karin, for this webinar. And thanks all of you for listening.